So I lived in the Balkans for a while, in Slovenia and Croatia, and a little bit in Romania. And at a certain point, about 6 years ago, I was living in Zagreb, and we were moving back to England, and I didn't want to teach. I was a teacher before, teacher and various other voluntary things, working with refugees and stuff. And I thought, I really don't want to do that. I've had enough of that. I want to do something to do with books, because books are my abiding passion. You know, I studied literature and blah, 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 and I also write myself. And I understood, and I think we talked a little bit about that now, that in the Balkans, they all have our stories, right? They all know our stories. They all know the same films, the same music that we have here in the West, right? But we have no goddamn idea about their stuff, right? And so it's very unequal, and it's a little bit imperialist in a way, because any British novel gets sent out all around the world. We just assume it's all going to be translated, it's going to be a hit everywhere, and yet we translate so little from abroad. So it's the famous 4% figure of translated works in the UK, and that includes non-fiction as well. So fiction is really a tiny part of that. And so I knew that there was this uneven balance, and whereas people always say you should write what you know, I kind of extended that and thought you should publish what you know. So I said, right, I've had this kind of long introduction to the Balkans, and I have lots of contacts here, and I love books, so it seemed to me like exactly the right thing to do. And so I kind of launched myself into it head first, and luckily won a grant for the EU funding, so I could actually get translations paid, because of course that's the most expensive part of the whole scenario, really, is the translations. So I was really lucky that I came across Will Firth, you probably read loads of his translations, haven't you? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so at the beginning he was like the only one I knew. So it was Will, and he's obviously a very, very good translator. So that was excellent. And I focused particularly on the ex-Yugoslavia, because I also speak Serbo-Croatian, so it was easier for me. I could check the original. I could, I felt much closer to it. So that's how it started. So I started like this with these 4 books that I had funded from the EU. And
which were they?
They were, now you put me on the spot, hang on a second. So they were Hansen's Children, The Coming by Andrei Nikolaidis, 7 Terrors, and A Handful of Sand by a Croatian writer, Marinko Koscic. And after I'd chosen Nikolaidis, he then won the European Union Prize for Literature, right? So that was great. I think I got extra points for that, even though it wasn't for that book. So that worked out really well. And then, I kind of just blundered along, really. At the beginning. I mean, I wasn't obviously living in England before. I wasn't involved in publishing, and no one knew me. I didn't know anyone. So it wasn't like I could draw on my contacts or my experience. I had to just kind of muddle along, and obviously if you know books, you love books, you have a feeling for editing and how it should be done. And I did an online course, and I just learnt as I went on, really. Wow. As I went along, yeah. And then I met other translators, I met other authors. I went on these fellowship programs. I was invited, and there were certain key people that helped me a lot on the way. And then kind of, so now I expanded to the whole Balkans, really. Except I've never done a title from Greece, which I'd like to do, but it just hasn't happened, and I like to kind of leave things to fate in a way. I like to see how things go, who I meet and how things turn out. So that's one of the joys for me.
How have you selected the books you've published?
Well, most of them, the majority of them for sure, are prize winners. So either they've won an international prize like the EU Prize for Literature, or they've won a local prize. And then you have, local prizes in each country, like the NIN in Serbia, and the Kresnik in Slovenia, for example, or they've won a regional prize like the Meša Selimovic, which is a prize named after the great Bosnian author, of course, but it's for any work published in that language, as in Serbo-Croatian or the 4 languages of that group. So that gives a bit of a national feel of it. And there's also a prize called the Balkanica Prize, which is what Prokopiev won. Yeah. So I look at these things. I kind of like, I'm keeping an eye on what's going on the local prize level, and then I'm meeting other publishers all the time and agents, and you just kind of hear the names, and you know what's going around and what's popular, or things that have been made into plays or films, or I remember at the beginning, right at the very beginning, I contacted Alec Popov, right, who is a very well-known writer in Bulgaria, and he did this very funny book called Mission London. I don't know if you read it.
I haven't read that, no.
Yeah, and it's a kind of like an old Carry On movie. It's like Carry On Up the Bulgarian Embassy or something like that. It's like a real slapstick comedy, and there's a film as well. And so when I started, I thought, I'd really like to get Mission London, because that's about Bulgaria, but it's also about London, people can relate to it. And Alec was a bit like, who are you? But then once I'd been around for a while, a couple of years, and I'd met him and been on a fellowship program there and stuff, he said, oh, well, if you want to still publish it, that's all right with me. So, yeah, it happens, that's how I choose people. Because if your focus is on that, you just start to hear the right names, the right books. And also, of course, you're also looking for stories you think that will be interesting for an English public, as some things are perhaps too local, or you don't think they'll translate properly because it's too much dialect or whatever. Some things I just don't think will work, in my opinion. And other things I think, no, that's really interesting, that has a global theme that everyone can relate to, or with the Quiet Foes the Urna, it's obviously about a very important subject, and I also think it's very important that we hear about that subject from people who actually lived through it, rather than from English people who went there and then left. I think that's a whole different thing, and so I'm particularly keen on doing those Bosnian authors. Even if they don't write about the war, that doesn't really matter, but I feel like Bosnia is in such a terrible state that really culture is one of the few things they have to celebrate, and they really should celebrate, because they have wonderful writers amongst, sportsmen and various other things. Culture is one thing that they have to celebrate, so, there you go. That's a long explanation.
No, I mean, that's one of the things I've got written down here was something Farouk said, which was that Bosnia is these were his words. I copied them down from my videos. That it's no longer popular in the way that Syria is popular now. Do you think there is less interest in Bosnia and that region now that it's more stable?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, you have this very kind of cynical comments that people make down in that region, like, oh, no one's interested in us unless there's a war, and then suddenly we're the most interesting thing around. And there were a few books that came out of the region during the war, wasn't there? I think probably the most famous one is Jergovic's Sarajevo Marlborough. And then you had Zlata's Diary, and you had various books, that concentrated at that time. And then nothing for quite a long time. I see that. But yes, they're not interested. People find it foreign. They don't know what's going on there. They don't necessarily think of Bosnia as a source of great literature, or like they might do Czech Republic, for example, knowing already some Czech authors. And I think this is part of the problem, that certain countries in the Balkans just don't have that history of great writers, not because they don't have them, but because they weren't translated, or the kind of default author everyone would mention, perhaps if they knew any, would be Ivo Andrić, right, who won the Nobel Prize, but in the 50s or something. This is quite a long time ago. It's very limited, and people's knowledge of that part of the world. So I have this kind of literary kind of mission, and this kind of like cultural mission as well. Yeah.
Why do you think it is a part of the world people don't know much about? When it is very interesting. There are these whole ideas of different cultures meeting and clashing. And
I mean, if any place has great stories, it's there, right? They have all these different nations and minorities and people passing through, and they've got Islam and Orthodox Christianity and Catholics and Jews, and it's really real source of inspiration, I would think. But why don't they know? I mean, I think people knew Yugoslavia, didn't they, to a certain extent. They knew it as a holiday destination, which tended to be the Croatian coast. But the inland part, I don't know. It's the insularity of the British or the English, coupled with an unfortunate situation where their writers were not translated, perhaps, as much as they should be.
How do you feel the legacy of the war affects the literature that's coming out of the region?
It's the few Croatian books I've done, the war's always mentioned, but it's not the central theme. The central theme is more, trying to make it in this new society, this kind of transition society, as you would like to call it. Well, people like to call it, and so it's a bit more like getting to grips with capitalism, getting to understand the way things work with this kind of background of what happened during the war. They don't deal with it head on. Yeah. It's kind of like some kind of scenery, let's say. Whereas obviously the Bosnian writers, I've published 4 Bosnian books, and one's a children's story, so it doesn't count, and 3 Bosnian books, and they're all pretty centrally about the war, pretty essential in that. So, and the Serbian books, again, no, they don't really. I don't think I've published any that really deal with it head on. No. Yeah. No, I haven't. Not so far. I published one very good Serbian book called The Great War, but it's obviously about the First World War, which is a whole different ball game. And that was fascinating for me because I learned a lot of stuff about it, which I didn't know, because we tend to be very focused on the Western Front. Whereas, of course, for them it was the Eastern Front that was interesting. So
it was where it started.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it started there. And in fact, the book opens with this great scene of the head mortician in Sarajevo wanting to go home, and they're telling him, no, you can't, you have to wait because there's 2 very important bodies coming. And then, of course, it's Franz Ferdinand and his wife, and they get laid out on the table and he has to do the autopsy. So it's, obviously that's the place where it started. It's very interesting. But I found that book really difficult to sell because, I don't know, perhaps the market was swamped with books about World War One. Perhaps people weren't willing or didn't want to know about the Eastern Front. I don't know. I found it really difficult to sell, and I was sorry because it's a hugely interesting book. Yeah.
Which books of yours are getting the most attention?
Well, Faruk's book got a lot of attention. I think people found it really interesting that he is a writer, but he was also a soldier. So this kind of poet soldier. It's an interesting combination, isn't it? Right. So, like I say, he's a witness to what happened, and he's also a writer. He's a poet. I think people found that really interesting. So there was a lot of interest. I think, he even did an interview on the World Service about the book when he was over, especially about the autobiographical parts. I mean, everyone wanted to ask him about that, basically. How much of it is true? Yeah. But of course, I think it's a fiction. It is fiction, So that got a lot of attention, and the Iliad, because I don't know if you've noticed, but it seems to me that recently there's been this kind of trend of discovering these lost classics and translating them, and these dead authors from the early 20th century or something. I don't know if it's things coming out of copyright or what it is, but I noticed that it's quite popular recently, and somehow I just got on that wave in a way with Iliad, and so that got a lot of attention as well, and it continues to sell, and people obviously know his name, and it's one of those kind of books you think, well, that'll be on my list for a long time, that won't go out of print.
How would you describe the cultures of the Balkans, of the different countries and regions? Sometimes I do get asked this question, is there any kind of unifying thing that I could say about Balkan literature? Yeah. And one thing that perhaps I could say is that there is this kind of theme of the individual versus history, or the individual versus fate, if you want to say it like that, of this kind of unequal battle which is bound to end badly for the individual. Do you see what I mean? That there is this idea that there is this weight of history or kind of swish of history that goes over there and takes out whatever it wants to in its wake, and you as a person can't really do anything about that. Perhaps that is a kind of a theme, that lack of agency. Yeah. You see what I mean? Which perhaps, obviously we don't feel the same way about it because we haven't had a war here for 1,000 years, and
we grow up in a very democratic society. We believe that we can make a difference.
Yeah.
And we can change things, and which is a nice belief to have, right? But I don't know if people there, they're much more jaded, they're much more aware of the fact that, you know, there are all these political factions, there is this, you know, weight of history dragging us down, bringing us back to this cycle, whatever. And so I think that maybe that is a theme that they perhaps excel in. Yeah. But then again, you get wonderful, you know, examples of completely opposite.
Yeah.
You know, so it's very difficult to generalise. But I think another thing is that most authors in that region, probably all of them, because it's such a small number of people. Populations are smaller, right? There's 4 million, 6 million, whatever. 10 million. I mean, Montenegro, 250,000 people, right?
Is that it?
Yeah,
Wow.
Montenegro. It's impossible to make a living from being a novelist or a short story writer. It's possible. So you have to do something else. Most of them are journalists, but you could do anything else, right? And because they have this second job, this source of income, they kind of write what they want. You know, because it's not their source of income.
Yeah.
Whereas perhaps writers here are more influenced by the publisher saying, right, we want a historical novel about, you know, an artist painting a woman or whatever, you know, and they say, oh, that really sold well. Can you write one a bit like that? Or I don't think publishers say that to authors there, and I don't think authors react like that. I think they just write what they want because, hey, what the hell, they're not going to make any money out of it anyway. So therefore you get really quirky, wacky, interesting stories, I think, because they're just doing it because they love it.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe people, when they pick up the books from there, they think, wow, you know, that's really fresh. The writing feels really fresh. The ideas are like, you know, I haven't read anything like that for a while. I think that's an advantage.